August 6, 1942. The Shokaku lay at anchor in Truk Lagoon, a floating fortress surrounded by still turquoise water that gave no hint of war. Inside, the air was heavy with humidity and cigarette smoke. The low hum of ventilation fans mixed with the distant drone of generators. In a cramped wardroom below deck, 5 Japanese naval officers sat around a table littered with casualty reports charts and intelligence summaries. The war had been going for only 8 months, and yet the silence in that room felt like the weight of a decade. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, his uniform immaculate, his eyes sunken from sleepless nights, studied the papers in front of him one last time. Then he set them down, exhaled slowly, and spoke the words no officer dared to say aloud. Gentlemen. The war is lost. No one moved. No one contradicted him. They didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. 2 months had passed since the disaster at Midway, just 60 days since Japan's illusion of invincibility had shattered against an invisible wall of American codebreakers and aircraft carriers. At Midway, Japan had sent 4 of its proudest fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Each one was a symbol of empire, the pride of naval aviation crewed by the finest pilots the Imperial Navy had ever trained. In a single morning, all 4 were gone, consumed by fire and smoke on the open sea. Their loss was more than hardware. It was the heart torn from Japan's naval soul. For a nation that measured honor by the sharpness of its steel and the precision of its plans, Midway was a spiritual earthquake. The admirals in that room aboard Shokaku had watched newsreels of their own propaganda, only weeks before Tokyo radio proclaiming Japan's inevitable victory newspaper headlines, celebrating the collapse of American morale. But they knew the truth those messages were hollow echoes bouncing off an empty sky. One of the younger officers shuffled uneasily, his hands trembling as he poured tea. It was a small sound, but it seemed deafening in the stillness. Outside, sailors moved across the deck in slow, weary patterns. They were the survivors of Coral Sea and Midway men who had seen comrades vanish in orange fireballs, who had returned home to find their triumphs rewritten into myths. The war had begun with light and glory, December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, a morning of rising suns and roaring engines. 8 months later, it was smoke and silence. The empire had grown, yes, stretched across the Pacific like a golden fan, but at its center the steel had already begun to rust. Yamaguchi's voice broke the silence again, softer this time, almost to himself. "We mistook thunder for victory," he said. "We forgot that even lightning fades." He gestured to the map pinned against the bulkhead, a vast sprawl of ocean dotted with red Japanese flags. Every island represented conquest: the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and the Solomons. The map looked magnificent. But to those who understood logistics, it was a death sentence written in ink. Each red flag meant another outpost to defend another line, to supply another promise of victory that the empire could no longer afford to keep. Across the table, Captain Mitsuo Fuchida sat quietly, his arm still in a sling from wounds sustained at Midway. Only months before, he had been the hero of Pearl Harbor, the man who led the air attack that had stunned the world. Now he looked older, worn as if the Pacific itself had drawn the youth from his face. "I watched Akagi burn," he murmured. "Our best men went down with her." They were smiling when the fire reached them. He paused, eyes distant. They believed Japan could not lose. The other officers avoided his gaze. Outside, faint strains of a military broadcast drifted through the steel walls. Tokyo radio was reporting another great victory in Burma. The announcer's voice was bright, triumphant, echoing through loudspeakers to the crew mess. "Our brave soldiers have crushed the enemy." But even the sailors listening no longer cheered. They stared at their rice bowls, eating in silence. In the weeks after, Midway letters from home had taken on a new tone. Wives wrote of rationing of air raid drills, of children collecting scrap metal in schoolyards. Yet the newspapers still showed smiling pilots beside cherry blossoms. To question the war was treason. To doubt was shame. And so the nation dreamed of victory while its admirals stared at the arithmetic of defeat. On the table, an intelligence summary detailed American production figures: more carriers, more planes, more oil. To an economist, it was data. To a warrior, it was prophecy. Yamaguchi closed his eyes. He remembered Pearl Harbor, not the explosion of bombs, but the moment before dawn when the sea was calm and every man believed he was about to change history. They had changed it, but not in the way they intended. He remembered Yamamoto's warning: I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The words had seemed poetic once. Now they felt mathematical. One of the staff officers finally spoke. "If the war is lost, Admiral, what are we to do?" Yamaguchi looked up. His eyes were steady now, almost serene. "We fight," he said, "because that is all we can do. But history will know the truth that we were defeated not in battle but in understanding." The ship's bell rang above deck, marking the hour. Outside, the tropical sun burned bright over Truk Lagoon. The men inside the room barely noticed. They sat in the shadows, surrounded by numbers that had no mercy. 2 months earlier at Midway, the ocean itself had turned against them. 4 carriers gone. Hundreds of aircraft lost. The elite of Japan's naval aviators trained for years, men who had memorized every signal, every maneuver, now gone in weeks. The Americans had lost 1 carrier. Japan had lost the war's balance forever. Yamaguchi stood slowly gathering the papers. "Gentlemen," he said, "history will ask how a nation that triumphed at Pearl Harbor could lose the Pacific within months." He looked toward the porthole where sunlight cut through the smoke like a blade. "The answer begins here with us." Outside, the lagoon shimmered in deceptive peace, its surface unbroken, except for the reflection of the rising sun, red, beautiful and fading. December the 7th, 1941. Dawn broke over the island of Oahu in gentle pinks and golds, the kind of quiet morning that seemed untouched by history. At 6 a.m., fishermen pushed their small boats into calm waters, the scent of salt and diesel mingling with hibiscus flowers. Church bells in Honolulu rang softly, their echoes swallowed by the sea breeze. To the west, over the dark horizon, a formation of planes appeared, tiny silhouettes against the rising sun. At first, the people who saw them thought they were American aircraft from the mainland. They were not. The first wave of 183 Japanese planes had risen from the decks of 6 carriers, Akagikaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, positioned north of the Hawaiian Islands. The pilots, some barely 20 years old, had been briefed to the second. Their target was Pearl Harbor, the heart of the US Pacific Fleet. At 7:48 a.m., torpedo planes skimmed across the harbor waters, their reflections glinting in the oil-slick surface. Within seconds, the calm was broken. A torpedo slammed into the side of the USS Oklahoma. Another struck the West Virginia. The harbor erupted into chaos. Dive bombers screamed down from the clouds, their engines howling like mechanical banshees. The Arizona took a direct hit, her forward magazine ignited, sending a column of flame 300 feet into the air. The explosion split the morning open. By 9:45 a.m. it was over. In barely 2 hours, Japan had executed one of the most precise and devastating naval air assaults in history. 8 American battleships lay sunk or damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, and 2 403 Americans killed. Smoke rolled across the water like a funeral shroud. For the men aboard the Japanese carriers, it was a spectacle of triumph. Messages flashed to Tokyo, Tora, 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 the code for complete surprise. In those first hours, Tokyo celebrated. The radio called it a divine wind over the Pacific. Newspapers declared that Japan had struck a blow so powerful the Americans would sue for peace. Across the empire, bells rang, children paraded with paper flags, and housewives bowed toward the imperial palace. But there was one man who did not celebrate. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, sat in his cabin aboard a kaigi, his face half lit by a single lamp. He knew the precision of the strike had been breathtaking, yes, but he also knew what hadn't been destroyed. The American aircraft carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were at sea and untouched. The massive fuel storage tanks at Pearl Harbor holding millions of gallons of oil were still intact. The submarine base and repair facilities, the arteries of America's future fleet had been left untouched. Yamamoto understood that victory in war was not the number of ships sunk in a morning. It was the destruction of the enemy's capacity to rebuild, and that capacity remained entirely alive. The second wave commander Mitsuo Fuchida later recalled the scene. "We circled back over the harbor and saw the flames rising ships listing, but the oil tanks, so vulnerable, so exposed, were untouched. It was like winning a duel, but leaving your opponent's sword in his hand." In Tokyo, no one wanted to hear warnings. The government had gambled everything on Yamamoto's promise, 6 months of unchallenged conquest before America could respond. That was the window, the fragile shimmering edge of advantage. But the attack had done more than cripple battleships. It had set fire to the American soul. That evening, President Franklin D. Roosevelt prepared a speech that would become immortal. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. His voice broadcast across a stunned nation transformed grief into resolve. The next morning, Congress declared war, and in factories from Detroit to Seattle, from Pittsburgh to San Diego, lights began burning through the night. Assembly lines that had once built cars now forged wings, engines, rifles. Men enlisted. Women poured into shipyards and hangars. The sleeping giant was stirring. Japan had achieved tactical perfection and strategic suicide. While Japanese radio played patriotic marches, American factories began multiplying steel by the ton. For every Zero Japan built, the United States would soon build 10 Hellcats. For every carrier Japan lost, America would launch 3 Essex-class replacements. The arithmetic of war had turned invisible but unstoppable. Yamamoto, a man who had studied in America and played poker with its naval officers, understood what few in Tokyo dared admit: Japan's empire was a candle burning at both ends. The glow was bright but brief. In the first 6 months of war, he had warned, "Before Pearl Harbor, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But after that, I have no expectation of success." Now that prophecy had begun ticking like a fuse. The attack that was meant to paralyze America had instead purified its will. The rising sun had awakened a storm. In the minds of those who planned Pearl Harbor, the United States was decadent, divided, too comfortable for a long war. Yet what they mistook for weakness was merely patience, and once provoked, that patience became a force of nature. The harbor still burned into the night, the reflections of flames rippling on the black water. Sailors dived again and again into the oily surface, searching for survivors trapped in overturned hulls. Some tapped from inside, their pounding echoing for days before the sound faded. Above them, the stars over the Pacific were cold and bright, indifferent to the fires below. Pearl Harbor had been, in the words of one American historian, a masterpiece of tactics and a catastrophe of strategy. The Japanese Empire had won a perfect morning and guaranteed a devastating tomorrow. The clock had begun to tick 6 months, perhaps 8, before American industry would rise like a tide that no empire could stop. And when it did, that same Pacific sky that glowed red with victory would soon glow red again with retribution. August 1942. In the sealed briefing room aboard Shokaku, the air was stifling again. Maps lay pinned beneath paperweights made from empty shell casings. A projector hummed faintly as new intelligence slides flickered across the wall. American shipyards, industrial cities, and carrier silhouettes drawn with cold precision. The admirals stared in silence. They were men trained to calculate victories in miles gained or ships sunk. But what they saw on those slides wasn't measured in territory, it was measured in numbers. The reports were astonishing. The United States already had a dozen new fleet carriers under construction, massive Essex-class ships, larger, faster, and more capable than anything Japan could build. The first would enter service within months. Behind them, a wave of escort carriers, destroyers, and submarines, dozens then hundreds, rolled off assembly lines like clockwork. By contrast, Japan had lost 4 of its precious fleet carriers at Midway and could replace none of them before 1944. The admirals' faces were pale, the weight of arithmetic pressing heavier than any bomb. One intelligence officer, his voice tight, read the figures aloud. American military aircraft production for 1941, 19,000. For 1943, projected 85,000. He paused. Japanese production, even under maximum output, 16,000. No one spoke for a moment. The silence was not disbelief, it was understanding. Outside that room, far across the Pacific, the industrial miracle had begun. In Detroit, night shifts roared under floodlights as sparks rained from welding torches. The smell of hot steel and oil filled the air. At Willow Run, Ford's massive plant, so large it had its own weather inside, was producing a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. In California, the Douglas and Lockheed plants thundered day and night rivet guns crackling like machine gun fire. Thousands of women, Rosie the Riveters, worked in coveralls, hair tied up in scarves, hands blistered from drills. In Chicago, machinists turned crankshafts the size of locomotives. In Seattle, Boeing, workers stood shoulder to shoulder on high catwalks, riveting wings that stretched wider than city streets. America was not just fighting a war, it was building one piece by piece with the precision of a factory clock. Back in Japan, the admirals knew their own factories could not match this. Their machine tools were worn from overuse, skilled labor was scarce, fuel was rationed, and air raids were beginning to test the home island's vulnerability. Japanese workers toiled with devotion and discipline, but devotion could not multiply output. Machines, not morale, decide long wars. Admiral Yamamoto studied the graphs, each one a quiet death sentence. Japan's industrial base was 1/10 the size of America's. Its oil reserves could barely sustain another year of full-scale operations. Even victory at sea would buy nothing if there were no ships to replace the lost ones. He turned to Captain Fuchida. Even if we sink 10 American carriers, he said, their factories will give them 20. What can we do against a nation that manufactures victory faster than we can imagine it? Fuchida said nothing. He stared at the wall, his jaw tight. Outside, faint waves slapped the hull, a sound like distant applause or mockery. To many officers, Japan's early triumphs had felt like destiny. Now they saw them for what they were, momentum borrowed against the future. Every burning oil field in the Dutch East Indies, every overextended supply line, every ship run dry of fuel was a reminder that their empire was built on sand. In the following weeks, reports from the home islands confirmed the pattern. The factories in Nagoya and Osaka were working around the clock, but without steel or copper, their output was barely sustaining the front lines. Aircraft production crawled. Training units struggled to find enough fuel for flight hours. Meanwhile, American propaganda films were showing audiences in Iowa and Ohio footage of their factories, the arsenal of democracy in motion. The message was simple: every rivet is a bullet for victory. The US wasn't merely arming its own forces, it was arming its allies, feeding Britain, Russia, and China with endless supplies. Japan was fighting not one enemy, but an entire industrial civilization. To the admirals, the realization came like a tide, unstoppable, patient cold. One officer, breaking the heavy silence, whispered what all were thinking. We thought courage could overcome material. We were wrong. Yamamoto nodded slowly. He knew that Japanese pilots were among the finest in the world, that their ships were crafted with care, their tactics honed to perfection. But even the sharpest blade dulls against the anvil of numbers. War stripped of its heroics was mathematics written in steel. In another world, perhaps Japan's precision and discipline might have won. But this was a new kind of war, a war of machines and men in equal measure, where the side that could repair faster, build longer, and ship farther would inevitably prevail. The flickering projector cast its pale light across the room, illuminating faces drawn tight with exhaustion. On the screen, the final slide appeared a bar graph comparing naval tonnage US production soaring upward like a skyscraper, Japan's line trailing flat at the bottom. No one applauded, no one cursed. They simply stared. In that moment, every man in the room understood the grim truth. Even if Japan fought flawlessly, even if every torpedo hit and every pilot returned, it would never be enough. The Empire had awakened a giant, and the giant was building an army out of smoke and iron. The meeting resumed after midnight. The officers gathered again, this time not to discuss ships or steel, but men, their most irreplaceable weapon. The charts spread before them were not production graphs or tonnage tables, but lists of names. Squadrons, units, rosters. Each line crossed out represented a man who would never fly again. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida stood to deliver the report. His arm was still bound in a sling from the burns he'd suffered at Midway, the smell of antiseptic still clinging to his uniform. He looked around the table, old comrades, some of whom had served with him since the China campaign. He spoke quietly without preamble. Since December, he began, the Imperial Navy has lost 40% of its carrier pilots. No one gasped, they already knew. But hearing it aloud made it real. These were not ordinary pilots, he continued. They were the men who struck at Pearl Harbor, who faced the Americans at Coral Sea and Midway. They were trained for years, trained until they could land on a pitching deck at night without thinking, until their formation flying was poetry. They were the best in the world. And they are gone. He placed his notes down and let the silence speak for him. Somewhere above deck, a Zero engine coughed to life testing perhaps, or just refusing to die quietly. Fuchida resumed his voice harder now. The replacement rate is inadequate. The training pipeline is broken. We are producing perhaps 100 carrier-qualified pilots per month. Many of them have less than 200 hours of flight time. Before the war, a naval aviator graduated with more than 800. He didn't need to explain the implications. These new men could fly but not fight. They could take off but not land under fire. To illustrate the point, he described a visit he'd made recently to a flight school near Kagoshima. The cadets there trained with wooden planes their engines removed to save fuel. Instructors sat in mock cockpits on the ground teaching tactics by drawing patterns in the dirt. When they finally did receive fuel allocations, each pilot might get 1 hour of flight per week. Some of them have never seen the ocean they are meant to defend, Fuchida said softly. He paused and looked around the table. We can build more planes, he said, but not more men. In contrast, the Americans were turning out aviators like an assembly line. Reports from intelligence units described vast training bases across Arizona, Texas, and Florida airfields, stretching to the horizon, classrooms filled with young men barely out of school. Every month, thousands graduated, each with more hours in the cockpit than Japan's best could hope to log before combat. The United States had turned the open skies into a factory. There were entire towns whose only purpose was to teach men to fly. Fuel was plentiful machines, abundant instructors rested. Even the ground crews were specialists trained in systems, maintenance, ordnance handling, and emergency repair. Japan's pilots were burning themselves out in the field, fighting 3 or 4 sorties a day, sleeping in cockpits and subsisting on rice balls and adrenaline. The Americans rotated theirs, sent them home to instruct the next wave multiplied experience through organization. War was supposed to be about valor. Instead, it had become a science of logistics. Yamaguchi took the casualty list from Fuchida's hand. He studied it, tracing his finger down the names. Many were familiar men he'd met on carrier decks, laughing in the wind, writing haikus before missions. Their call signs still painted on empty bunks. Now their ghosts filled the wardrooms. He looked up and said quietly, "We trained for years to win the first 6 months. We never asked how to fight the 7th. Outside, the night was eerily still. Overhead, the sky that had once carried the rising sun flag now felt vast and hostile." Fuchida went on. "At this rate," he said, "by mid-1943 our carrier groups will be hollow. Even if we build new carriers, there will be no one left to fly from them." He showed them the data sortie rates, replacement curves, attrition graphs. Cold numbers hiding human faces. One admiral rubbed his temples, whispering, "Even the eagles are bleeding." It wasn't only pilots they were losing, it was the knowledge of how to win. Experience itself was dying. Each down days took with him the hard-learned lessons of carrier warfare, of improvisation, of survival. Japan's training manuals could not teach instinct. Fuchida recalled one of his flight instructors from the 1930s, an old master who used to tell his students, "The sky has no mercy. It belongs to whoever understands it best." Now, Fuchida thought bitterly, it belonged to someone else. He closed his folder and saluted. "That is all, Admiral." Yamaguchi nodded. He knew the report was more than statistics, it was an obituary for Japan's aerial supremacy. The Admiral sat for a while in the dim light, hearing only the faint drone of a patrol plane passing overhead. Once that sound had meant safety, a Japanese eye watching over the Pacific. Now it sounded like a question with no answer. Fuchida stared at the ceiling, lost in memory. He could still see the decks of Akagi at Pearl Harbor, his men grinning, the wind ripping through their scarves as they launched into perfect formation. Back then, the sky had seemed infinite and theirs alone, but that illusion had died with the carriers at Midway. Now he realized the Empire's most precious battlefield was slipping away, not inch by inch, but pilot by pilot. He said it quietly, almost to himself. The sky that once belonged to Japan is becoming American property. No one argued. Outside, the moon hung low over Truk Lagoon, reflected in the still water like a fading sun. The meeting resumed after midnight. The officers gathered again, this time not to discuss ships or steel, but men their most irreplaceable weapon. The charts spread before them were not production graphs or tonnage tables, but lists of names. Squadrons, units, rosters. Each line crossed out represented a man who would never fly again. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida stood to deliver the report. His arm was still bound in a sling from the burns he'd suffered at Midway, the smell of antiseptic still clinging to his uniform. He looked around the table, old comrades, some of whom had served with him since the China campaign. He spoke quietly, without preamble. Since December, he began the Imperial Navy has lost 40% of its carrier pilots. No one gasped, they already knew. But hearing it aloud made it real. These were not ordinary pilots, he continued. They were the men who struck at Pearl Harbor, who faced the Americans at Coral Sea and Midway. They were trained for years, trained until they could land on a pitching deck at night without thinking until their formation flying was poetry. They were the best in the world, and they are gone. He placed his notes down and let the silence speak for him. Somewhere above deck, a zero-engine coughed to life testing perhaps, or just refusing to die quietly. Fuchida resumed his voice harder now. The replacement rate is inadequate. The training pipeline is broken. We're producing perhaps 100 carrier-qualified pilots per month. Many of them have less than 200 hours of flight time. Before the war, a naval aviator graduated with more than 800. He didn't need to explain the implications. These new men could fly but not fight. They could take off but not land under fire. To illustrate the point, he described a visit he'd made recently to a flight school near Kagoshima. The cadets there trained with wooden planes their engines removed to save fuel. Instructors sat in mock cockpits on the ground teaching tactics by drawing patterns in the dirt. When they finally did receive fuel allocations, each pilot might get 1 hour of flight per week. Some of them have never seen the ocean they are meant to defend, Fuchida said softly. He paused and looked around the table. We can build more planes, he said, but not more men. In contrast, the Americans were turning out aviators like an assembly line. Reports from intelligence units described vast training bases across Arizona, Texas, and Florida airfields, stretching to the horizon, classrooms filled with young men barely out of school. Every month, thousands graduated, each with more hours in the cockpit than Japan's best could hope to log before combat. The United States had turned the open skies into a factory. There were entire towns whose only purpose was to teach men to fly. Fuel was plentiful, machines, abundant instructors rested. Even the ground crews were specialists trained in systems maintenance, ordnance handling, and emergency repair. Japan's pilots were burning themselves out in the field, fighting 3 or 4 sorties a day, sleeping in cockpits, and subsisting on rice balls and adrenaline. The Americans rotated theirs, sent them home to instruct the next wave multiplied experience through organization. War was supposed to be about valor. Instead, it had become a science of logistics. Yamaguchi took the casualty list from Fuchida's hand. He studied it, tracing his finger down the names. Many were familiar men he'd met on carrier decks, laughing in the wind, writing haikus before missions. Their call signs still painted on empty bunks. Now their ghosts filled the wardrooms. He looked up and said quietly, "We trained for years to win the first 6 months. We never asked how to fight the 7th. Outside, the night was eerily still. Overhead, the sky that had once carried the rising sun flag now felt vast and hostile. Fuchida went on, "At this rate," he said, "by mid-1943 our carrier groups will be hollow. Even if we build new carriers, there will be no one left to fly from them." He showed them the data sortie rates, replacement curves, attrition graphs, cold numbers hiding human faces. One admiral rubbed his temples, whispering, "Even the eagles are bleeding." It wasn't only pilots they were losing, it was the knowledge of how to win. Experience itself was dying. Each downed ace took with him the hard-learned lessons of carrier warfare, of improvisation, of survival. Japan's training manuals could not teach instinct. Fuchida recalled one of his flight instructors from the 1930s, an old master who used to tell his students, "The sky has no mercy. It belongs to whoever understands it best." Now Fuchida thought bitterly it belonged to someone else. He closed his folder and saluted. "That is all, Admiral." Yamaguchi nodded. He knew the report was more than statistics, it was an obituary for Japan's aerial supremacy. The admirals sat for a while in the dim light, hearing only the faint drone of a patrol plane passing overhead. Once that sound had meant safety, a Japanese eye watching over the Pacific. Now it sounded like a question with no answer. Fuchida stared at the ceiling, lost in memory. He could still see the decks of Akagi at Pearl Harbor, his men grinning, the wind ripping through their scarves as they launched into perfect formation. Back then, the sky had seemed infinite and theirs alone, but that illusion had died with the carriers at Midway. Now he realized the Empire's most precious battlefield was slipping away not inch by inch, but pilot by pilot. He said it quietly, almost to himself. The sky that once belonged to Japan is becoming American property. No one argued. Outside, the moon hung low over Truk Lagoon, reflected in the still water like a fading sun. By late August 1942, Admiral Yamaguchi had begun to fear not enemy fleets or aircraft, but silence the silence of ships that never arrived. Every week, reports from the Ministry of the Navy painted the same picture: convoys vanishing, tankers overdue, merchantmen gone without trace. He spread the figures across the table like a map of slow starvation. January, he said flatly, 15 merchant ships lost. By June, 30. In August, 40. He didn't need to raise his voice. The numbers did the shouting for him. In less than a year, Japan's maritime lifelines, the veins that carried the empire's lifeblood of oil rice and iron, were being cut one by one. The men in the room knew what it meant. Japan was an island nation with the appetite of a continent. Its fields could not feed its armies. Its wells could not fuel its ships. Everything that powered the empire, coal from Korea, rice from Indochina, bauxite from the Dutch East Indies, and above all oil, had to come by sea. And the sea was no longer safe. American submarines, once clumsy and plagued by faulty torpedoes, were learning. Their tactics grew ruthless, their numbers multiplied. They prowled the shipping lanes from the Philippines to Formosa, striking in wolf packs surfacing under moonlight to finish the helpless with deck guns. By 1942, the ocean itself had become a graveyard. There were stories whispered among the survivors of merchantmen burning in the South China Sea, their decks slick with flaming oil, sailors clinging to wreckage as the sky turned black with smoke. Of ships that vanished without distress, calls swallowed whole by the Pacific. Of oil slicks stretching for miles, shimmering under the sun like floating mirrors of ruin. A few lucky crews were rescued by passing destroyers. Most simply disappeared. The ocean had begun devouring its makers. Yamaguchi looked out the porthole toward the lagoon that had once been a sanctuary for the combined fleet. Beneath the tranquil surface, he imagined the unseen shapes of submarines, small steel predators waiting for their next meal. The empire that had once commanded the waves was now surrounded by invisible hunters. Japan's naval doctrine had never been built for this kind of war. Its submarines were designed to fight other warships, not to strangle trade. Commerce raiding was considered unworthy an act for nations without honor. Yet honor, Yamaguchi thought bitterly, would not fuel a destroyer. Oil imports, he read from another page, 400,000 tons in January, 250,000 by August. He looked up. Gentlemen, by next year at this rate we will have oil fields in the Indies, but no way to bring the oil home. The irony was unbearable. The very conquest meant to secure Japan's resources had stretched its supply lines so thin that they were now self-destructing. He turned to the wall map once more. Red arrows traced routes from Borneo and Sumatra to the home islands. Each arrow crossed zones marked by a new color black. Those were the submarine hunting grounds. Every one of those lines, Yamaguchi realized, was now a gamble. Japan's shipyards could build perhaps 200,000 tons of merchant shipping per year. America's submarines were sinking 300,000, and the rate was rising. The Admiral sat in uneasy silence. Each loss was more than tonnage, it was time. Time for industry to run, for aircraft to train, for factories to breathe. Without those ships, every bolt, every bullet, every gallon of fuel became a countdown. There were other consequences too, less visible, but corrosive. Factories in Osaka and Nagoya began rationing power. Schools held collection drives for scrap metal. Women patched uniforms by candlelight. Soldiers at the front learned to save bullets to fire only when certain. And everywhere people whispered the same phrase, "The convoys are late." Japan had always defined itself by the sea. It was the pathway of its gods, its trade, its destiny. The islands had risen from the ocean had carried them to empire. But now that same ocean had turned against them. An island empire, Yamaguchi thought, was a paradox, a fortress surrounded by water that promised protection, but demanded obedience. The sea was both wall and trap. He remembered the words of a Meiji-era admiral he'd once studied. If we lose control of the sea, we lose control of life itself. That prophecy was unfolding now. In Tokyo, officials tried to hide the scale of the crisis. Newspapers still printed images of smiling workers and fully loaded freighters. But in the port cities, reality was impossible to conceal. Docks once crowded with ships now stood half empty. Fuel drums arrived bone dry. American submarines, once derided as cowards' weapons, had become the invisible hand closing around Japan's throat. Each month that grip tightened, and Yamaguchi understood the future better than most. By 1944, the factories would not fall to bombing raids. They would die quietly starved of fuel, their machines slowing to silence. The tanks would rust where they stood, the planes would sit grounded, and the empire would suffocate not in defeat on the battlefield, but in the stillness of its own harbours. He looked again at the shipping chart, the web of red and black lines crossing the Pacific like veins under a dying skin. "Gentlemen," he said, finally, his voice low, "our empire is bleeding from invisible wounds. We have not been defeated by armies. We are being strangled slowly, inevitably, by the sea itself." Outside, the lagoon shimmered beneath the moonlight, calm and indifferent. Somewhere out beyond the horizon, another Japanese freighter was sinking into darkness, another crew swallowed by waves. And with every ship that vanished beneath the Pacific, Japan's future sank a little deeper with it. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving Truk Lagoon wrapped in mist. The ships at anchor loomed like ghosts, grey silhouettes in a grey sea. Inside Shokaku's wardroom, the admirals gathered again. The charts and casualty lists were gone, now replaced by something heavier, the question that haunted every mind in the Imperial Navy. Where did it all begin to go wrong? They traced the chain of failure backward from the Solomons to Midway, to the spark that had ignited everything Pearl Harbor. But Yamaguchi knew that the unraveling hadn't started with the lost ships or dead pilots. It had begun with an illusion, a nation's conviction that courage could defy reality. He turned toward a new set of documents laid on the table, the analysis of the Doolittle raid. 16 B-25 bombers launched from the USS Hornet in April 1942 had flown across the Pacific and bombed Tokyo, Nagoya, and Kobe. The material damage was negligible. A few warehouses burned some power lines down, but the psychological wound was profound. For the first time, the Japanese homeland had been touched by foreign hands. Tokyo's citizens who had believed their islands untouchable watched in shock as the air raid sirens wailed. Mothers huddled in shelters, children cried in disbelief. The military had promised that Japan's sacred soil was beyond reach. The Doolittle raid shattered that illusion. The Americans proved something that day, Yamaguchi said softly. That distance is not protection. That pride is not armor. In the Imperial Palace, panic turned to fury. Army officers demanded retaliation. It was this humiliation, not strategic logic, that had accelerated the Midway operation. Japan had rushed to lure the American fleet into a decisive battle, to erase the shame of those burning rooftops. In doing so, they walked straight into a trap. The Americans knew they were coming. Through the secret program known as Operation Magic, US intelligence had broken Japan's naval codes. Every radio message, every convoy schedule, every operation plan was intercepted and deciphered. The Japanese believed their codes unbreakable, built on complex linguistic patterns. But the Americans had patience and machines. Weeks before the battle, Admiral Chester Nimitz already knew the target was AF Midway. He knew the date, the approach, the strength of the enemy. When Japan's carriers sailed into the trap, the Americans were waiting armed with foreknowledge and fueled by vengeance. Yamaguchi stared at the code-breaking report. "We were beaten before we began," he said quietly. "We fought blind against an enemy who could see our every move." Another officer, younger and less restrained, broke the silence. Then why, he demanded, did no one tell the truth? Why did no one question the plan? The room froze. Yamaguchi looked at him, neither angry nor surprised. Because he said truth has no rank in this navy, he meant it literally. In the Imperial Navy, obedience was sacred doubt, a form of betrayal. Junior officers who questioned strategy were branded as cowards or defeatists. Reports that contradicted expectations were rewritten. Optimism became policy. Dissent became treason. Another admiral added bitterly, "We censored ourselves before the enemy ever could." There had been voices of warning, of course, Yamamoto himself among them. Before the war, he had told the Army Ministry that Japan could fight America for 6 months, perhaps a year, but not longer. He had lived in the United States, studied at Harvard, played poker with American officers. He understood what Japan's leaders refused to see, that America's strength was not its battleships or aircraft, but its endless patience and production. "America is like a steel mill," he once told a colleague. "Slow to heat, but once hot, impossible to cool." But Yamamoto's warning had been buried under the weight of ideology. The generals wanted war. The politicians wanted empire. The public wanted glory. And so, the nation that could least afford a long war chose to start one. In the Shokaku's wardroom, the admirals began to debate what might have been. What if Japan had never attacked Pearl Harbor? What if it had struck only British and Dutch possessions in Southeast Asia, avoiding a direct confrontation with the United States? Without Pearl Harbor, one officer said the Americans might have delayed their entry. Roosevelt wanted war, but his people did not. Another countered, then they would have entered later with even greater strength. We would only have postponed our defeat. The conversation turned darker. What if Nagumo had launched a third wave at Pearl Harbor, someone asked. If we'd destroyed the fuel tanks, the submarine base, the repair yards could, we have delayed their recovery. Yamaguchi's eyes narrowed. Perhaps by months, he admitted. But not by years. Even if we had burned every drop of oil in Hawaii, America has oceans of it at home. The younger officer spoke again, his voice low. Then Admiral, was there ever a path to victory? Yamaguchi didn't answer immediately. He walked to the porthole and stared at the horizon. The mist had lifted and the morning light shimmered on the water. Perhaps, he said finally, if we'd avoided war altogether. It was a dangerous thing to say even here. But no one contradicted him. He continued. Our leaders saw the world as a contest of will, not of resources. They mistook faith for foresight. They believed that courage could substitute for coal and sacrifice could replace oil. He turned back to the room. But wars are not decided by prayer. They are decided by arithmetic. A long silence followed. The only sound was the faint ticking of the ship's clock. Yamaguchi rested his hand on the table, his voice now a whisper. Admiral Yamamoto said it best. In the first 6 months I will run wild and win victory upon victory, but after that I have no expectation of success. He looked at each man in turn. We are living in that after. Outside, the mist dissolved into sunlight. The Pacific stretched endless and indifferent, a mirror of both triumph and tragedy. The Admiral sat in the quiet realization that they were no longer the masters of the sea, only passengers on a course they could not change. The fatal math had been written long before the first shot was fired. It was not numbers that doomed Japan, it was belief. The night's discussions had drained every voice, every argument, every illusion. When the final report arrived from Tokyo, Yamaguchi unfolded it in silence. It was the Ministry of Finance's latest forecast rows of figures, cold and merciless. The projections ended not in words but in zeros. Even under the most favourable conditions, he read aloud, the Empire's industrial capacity will collapse by late 1944. Fuel reserves exhausted, shipping tonnage irrecoverable, economic self-sufficiency impossible. No one moved. The only sound was the low hum of the ship's engines vibrating faintly through the steel. The men in that room were warriors trained to command fleets to fight until death. But this kind of defeat, one delivered by mathematics, had no honour, no ceremony. Yamaguchi closed the folder slowly and spoke the words none of them wanted to hear. We are approaching the end not in battle, but in arithmetic. He looked around the table. Every face was motionless, drained of defiance. Some officers stared down at their hands. One rubbed his thumb across a ring, the gold dulled from salt and time. Another traced the edge of his teacup as if waiting for something, an order perhaps, or permission to despair. Gentlemen, Yamaguchi said quietly, it is my belief that we must seek peace. Immediately, before we lose the ability to speak at all. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then the murmur began, soft at first, then rising. Impossible, unthinkable, treason. The word hung in the air like smoke. They all knew what would happen if such a proposal reached Tokyo. The militarists would brand them cowards. The secret police would whisper of disloyalty. Yamaguchi's career, his family, perhaps even his life gone. Yet he said it anyway because truth had finally become heavier than fear. No one will listen, one of the older admirals said. The government has mistaken stubbornness for honour. Yamaguchi nodded. Then history will have to be our witness. Outside, the first hints of dawn bled across the sky. The officers gathered their papers, their movements slow and deliberate, as though ritual could disguise resignation. One by one, they left the wardroom without salutes. When the door closed, the ship was silent again. The low sound of the waves tapping against the hull echoed like a heartbeat, the last pulse of an empire still pretending to be alive. Yamaguchi lingered alone at the table. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small stack of letters, ones he had written to his wife but never mailed. He added a new page, his handwriting steady but tired. My dearest, if you hear news of victories, believe half. If you hear of defeats, believe them fully. The war will not end in glory but in silence. Remember that I fought not because I believed we could win, but because I could not abandon those who believed we must. He folded the letter carefully, placed it among the others, and sealed them in a tin box. Somewhere on deck, a mechanic was draining the last drops of aviation fuel from a drum into a Zero's tank. The liquid gurgled and sputtered, thin, precious, almost gone. The smell of gasoline drifted through the morning air, sharp and bitter. Yamaguchi stepped outside. The horizon was just beginning to glow pink. The lagoon looked peaceful again, as if the war were a dream that could dissolve with daylight. From afar, the Shikaku seemed proud and unbroken, her flag rippling gently in the breeze. But beneath that flag the men knew. They had seen the numbers. They had read the future. The Empire had already fallen, it was simply still standing. Courage had carried them this far, but courage without truth was only blindness, and loyalty without wisdom had turned into a chain. As the first rays of sunlight struck the sea, Yamaguchi whispered what every admiral in that room had secretly understood. Japan lost the war on December 7th, 1941. It simply hadn't learned it yet. The sun rose higher, casting gold across the quiet water. A crewman closed the hangar doors, sealing the shadows within. Somewhere deep in the ship's belly, a typewriter stopped clicking, the last report completed. For a moment, all was still, the Empire suspended between past and future, between honour and ruin. Then the day began again, and duty resumed its masquerade.